We're going to get started with our next presenter, Robin Galipeau from OpenPlus. He's the direct... Excuse-moi, je vais juste te laisser te présenter pour au niveau de ton poste. Merci.
This on? Yeah, great. Yeah. All right. Just... All right. Presenting without notes, but no worries. Okay, second presentation today, so I'm a bit brainwashed into what I just finished off earlier today. Open source helps government meet compliance. So we're going to take a little bit of time on this, and just so that I make sure you guys have to stick around, my takeaways are going to be a fish, a wolf, and Kenny Rogers. So you guys are certainly going to be staying tuned because your curiosity is going to get the best of you. I'm the managing partner at OpenPlus, 15 plus years devoted into the open source advocacy sector, if you will, and I co-founded the Open Source Alliance of Canada with Mike Gifford. I'm the managing partner at OpenPlus, and we are solely working on public sector initiatives with Canadian government and anything that's around public sector. Websites, portals, intranets, collaborative apps, everything we do by nature, therefore, is multilingual, accessible, mobile responsive. And the tools we primarily use are Drupal, Solr, and WxT for just about every project that we'll work on. That includes web services, API integrations with other tools, and we're a local shop. So I'm sure you guys have heard open source 50 times today, if not a few hundred, and everyone's got their own take on what open source is, but this is definitely our views on it. The aspect of cost and free licenses and open code for us is not the true nature of what open source is. It might meet a few people's definitions, but for us the benefit of open source is around the organic nature that it can help people co-develop and help communities achieve a common goal, can help us meet compliance standards easier, and it certainly helps improve security. So when I talk about compliance, well, what do I mean? And for us, some of the bigger components that we look at, evidently accessibility. It's a legally mandated requirement, if not provincially, depending where you are. And that's an evolving thing now. We're starting to see requirements for WCAG 2.1. Language, we legally have to hit both languages most of the time, and we're seeing people who want to do more. Browser compliance, cross-browser, Java fallback, mobile, that's a moving target and it keeps changing on us, so evidently something people need to keep up with. Interoperability and open APIs. So, how do you ensure that your data isn't locked in and that it's I don't want to say hostage, but you've got to make sure that you have access to your data in and out of your environments and that you can integrate with anything as a true open API. Security also is evidently a big component to this. Open source and security have always had this connotation around it, which is, in our opinion, security through obscurity has failed, and if anything, it's better through an open source environment. The more set of eyes there are on something, the better. Now, we've traveled quite a bit for Drupal events, and ironically, we've gone to a few of the Drupal GovCons that have taken place, and what we did notice is that, Canada has a bar that's actually quite higher than a lot of people. We legally have to hit a lot of these mandates, so not all other governments have the same challenges we do. So effectively, it's meant that we have to do a lot more to try to reach compliance. So the premise of this presentation is a little bit to sort of reverse engineer and show how we were able to achieve one of our more recent projects. So there was a project we did with ISED, it's a government department, and it was a profile portal. So this is sort of going to tell their story and how they were organically able to inherit a lot of open source to achieve what they got done. If we look at the ask for them, this is a scientist profiles database. So it was an app modernization. It was a legacy application running on ASP that was end of life, and the data was sort of locked in. They couldn't even really change it, and even some of the scientists that were in this data had passed away, so they needed to move this data quickly. So, it wasn't meeting WET4 compliance. It wasn't accessible. It wasn't mobile responsive yet. And they needed it to look more like Canada.ca since it was feeding off of the new look and feel, if you will. It needed to be an authenticated application with self-serve so that scientists could manage their own profiles. And there was around 2,000 users with their own records with relational data, and that needed to port over. And they needed a workflow to approve people as well as sort of manage correspondence so that users were notified that new accounts came into play, and it needed to be a whole managed service here on Canadian soil, etc. So this was a project that was done in 30 days. So when you look at the achievement of something like this, you say, hey, project got deployed 100% open source on Drupal WxT, WxT4 compliant, little to no code, now met 2.0 level AA with proper multilingual, and I say proper because not all Drupal sites that are multilingual would actually meet Treasury Board of Canada standards. Canada.ca look and feel, so it was inheriting footers, inheriting headers automatically from the content delivery network. And it had an open API so that taxonomies and control vocabularies could actually be web services to other departments who needed to harvest that data for their own needs. Bulk scripted the migration of their accounts as well as their data, and put together a workflow that included authenticated components where at least the build they knew had gone through SANAs and formal threat risk assessments where they knew that they could trust the sign-in aspect of the platform. And this was in the end deployed on a AWS on Canadian region as a managed service. Now, just show a couple of quick screenshots on the solution after it was deployed. So this is the public front-end site after the 30-day migration, as most people would typically consume it. There was a workflow deployed for them internally to review and deal with a request for people who wanted to change their profile, as well as how accounts get created or get reassociated with existing scientists. And when a scientist came on site, they would effectively log into the site. They would see their profile. They could request a change, update their profile. And then the tools internally that I said got to use, these were all tools that they directly inherited. So we look at a workflow where it would tag something as needs review, email someone internally. And now internally they were able to see, well, let's compare the first revision with the last revision, and field by field show me exactly what changed. And those are big efficiency factors when you think of it. When you look at environments where there's 50 plus fields or really long-winded text and someone is tasked with approving a change, do I need to read the whole thing? No, you can just see the changes. This was removed, this was added these two terms and changed this text. None of this stuff, actually it was all just value add. The client didn't even necessarily need this or ask for it or even know it existed, but they inherited some, these types of things. So if we roll the clock and look at, how does an achievement like this happen? Let's look at a sort of late 2010 to today, and we're going to look at things a bit more through a timeline. So the Web Experience Toolkit is born. Most of you probably have heard or know of WxT. One of the best decisions that Treasury Board did was to open source it. And effectively, it's gone through, I think, 90 releases to date. They've had good code fest. And WxT is largely around standards and compliance factors that it's setting the bar for what people need to work with. Fast forward a bit, StatsCan starts to aggressively adopt Drupal and WxT, and they start to openly work with the community and start putting together, here are our experiences, here are the modules we're using, here's our configuration, and they started to build that out into an install profile called a distribution. That's one of the first screenshots back from when it was 3.1, I think it was. And if you fast forward to today, they're still using the deployment. I believe it's on Drupal 8 now. But it's nice that they're using all their rich features. You're actually logging in. It's your own profile. You can comment on items. So it's more than just a static public website. They've actually started to use a lot of custom dashboard features and notifications and digests, etc. And from there, they kickstarted the Open Data Initiative. And it's always important to note their achievement, that it's nice to see that they were now ranked the first, #1 in the world as far as open source leaders. So from there, the Drupal WxT distribution sort of takes flight and becomes a little bit more formal. So they went through some vetting processes. They hired Acquia to come in, the founders of Drupal, to look at the distribution, give them feedback. I believe at one point IBM got called in to do a threat risk assessment on the build itself. And they've just kept escalating the build where they can, but they did it openly and they always contributed back. And they did so in a way that the community could also take part and work with the build. And a lot of times what this meant was, instead of just going off and building something yourself because you had a need, even if you're in Drupal, they would find the common best used module that already had critical mass. And if it wasn't, if it was missing translation strings around something, then they would tag it appropriately or request that the maintainer do it, or work with accessibility, and they would just try to take the community modules and up them to bring them up to par so that this would work. And today you can go and download right from Drupal, and in a 5-minute install, you're meeting this compliance right out of the gates. So it certainly was a big achievement. Now, if we look at projects that have taken place that have leveraged this in the public sector over time, one of the first projects that was on it, which I believe was still in beta back then, Drupal WxT, ironically, was Standards Council of Canada. So they turned to Drupal WxT to do their public site. It's still working on it. Mike and I got to work on that project together. There's a few of those in here, Mike. But ironically, you're able to search for standards on this site, and those standards were in an environment that weren't complying with accessibility and multilingual. So ironically, we're able to harvest some of that data and present it through an interface like Drupal WxT, where now they were meeting those standards. I'm going to show a few of these a little bit more quickly so that we can keep the conversation going. But City of Ottawa moved from Oracle UCM to Drupal WxT, and since then they've built up their own distribution in their own versions, but they certainly learned a lot from the Drupal WxT distribution. City of Hamilton is running on it for this and a few other applications like their lobbyist registry. University of Ottawa was a big adopter of Drupal WxT out of the gates. They were on the steering committee for Drupal WxT, and they were giving back wherever they could, and since then they've evolved into their own distribution. They are a big outfit. They've got 1,000+ sites that they deploy, and they're running their student portal and their employee portal off Drupal. Keep that yardstick moving more around the Drupal WxT builds. Official Languages is running off of it. Their Official Languages intranet is now running off Drupal WxT. We've seen NRC run their national intranet off Drupal WxT. Environment Canada have done some deployments that are actually quite similar to what was in the ISED deployment that we talked a bit earlier, and this was a collaboration with other people in their constituents in other governments. The United Nations Open Data Portal, if you go to that today, that's still running Drupal WxT. It was a recent deployment, and it was nice because it had a full open API to other data that was brought in with React.js visualizations. And the Intranet for Health Canada nationally, including all of their branches and FAC, is all running through this build. A few quick others here is the Mental Health Commission of Canada. When you go to their site and how they do their training and how you register for training and pay for training and look at maps of where they hold their training is all done through this platform. And Veterans Affairs has a portal for their careers that they career orientation with veterans, but it's a full collaborative portal where they can get coaching through this solution. So there's a few other bills like CATSA that have happened, and even internal applications like Canada Gazette, when it needs to publish and go through a production workflow, it's all done through this tool. So if you look at in about a time span of maybe 2-3 years, these projects got deployed, and these are just the ones that we were directly involved in. There are others. I know that most of the Office of have been deployments. Governor General and a few others have also worked off the Drupal WxT distribution. So fast forward that, and we look at things now through, there's a few provinces that have started to do big adoptions on Drupal WxT. The government of PI did their whole Web Renewal initiative. It's around 80,000 pages or so, 50 sites that got consolidated. And I do believe to this day they have one of the best search experiences that I've seen. And that's usually for us an indication of a site that's architected properly. If you see good content types and you can drill down into content and it's searching inside files and the digital services are there as well, and you can filter out content from web services or departments, that's usually a good indication that the site's been architected quite well. They also have around 1,000 digital services that they're about 210, I think, or so that they've been able to put online. And they can deploy a digital service in around 10 minutes. So whether it's a PDF or a web form, whether there's a cost and a payment, whether you're paying taxes, whether you're getting permits for a liquor license, and it's even had some CBC articles written around the fact that their citizens are just amazed at a lot of that red tape, and it facilitated a lot of their processes internally. So they've been a great champion of this as well. And what we've done is we took some of our friends at Yukon government and put them in touch directly with the PEI government. And we said, you guys need to talk maybe a little bit more because you're both provinces that are a little bit smaller. They still have all the same objectives and mandates that they have to hit from some of the bigger provinces, but they got smaller budgets. So when you go to Yukon, they've relaunched their site off Drupal WxT, and they've got their standards beta site that's also running off Drupal WxT. And they try to share notes and have discussions with PI where and when they can. So that's sort of, if you look back at everything that took place, that takes us back to, where ICED and how ICED was able to get, off the ground in that time frame. And some of you who work with that department know that they're very involved as an API store, and I believe they have some deployments internally around IBM API Connect. And what's interesting is when you go to their GitHub page for IBM, that one of the most popular or most active directory is the Drupal portal that's available to you. So here they are buying into an API engine to be, I believe, the storefront for APIs for Government of Canada. And it's great to see that even with IBM, there's a lot of activity taking place on the Drupal side of things. So let's look at value to cost for Canadians, right? And how it keeps paying it forward, if you will. You look at a project like ICED where that was like a 30-day window. And if you look at the time and effort and the cost factor that falls into a project like that, how is that even feasible? Well, you have to factor the value that comes from all of those other projects. Every one of those projects had a lesson learned. Every one of those projects either contributed a piece of code or moved the yardstick, or something was tested for them or helped them meet compliance. And if you go back in time and you factor even the broader scale of it, well, Drupal itself, that was another component that, in and itself evidently was a big component, right down to the MySQL, PHP, and Linux stack. PHP, I think to this day, still runs like 82% of the web or 86% of the web. If you're wondering what that first bullet is before Linux, well, that's when the aliens brought open source DNA to planet Earth, sometimes before Christ. 1985. 1985. Precisely. Looking at that whole value chain, I mean, it represents millions of lines of code, vetted and tested threat risk assessments, and it's actively maintained and fully portable. So it is a true transparent, and if software can be organic in any way, this is a good example as best as it gets. Now, look to the future then, right? So if you look at even today, there's already work being done for WxT 5 with Drupal WxT. And Drupal is going to React in its back end for Drupal 9. And WxT 5 is going to include React. And those things are already taking place. So the timing is great, but it's great to see both those communities that are already starting to work. And of course, as accessibility standards start to evolve, well, that's all work that is getting done for you. So how you keep up with pace of innovation and how you factor things like feature velocity, you can't own all of that for yourself, and your department can't do all of that for you. So you certainly have to leverage where you can. Your needs are going to grow. So whatever someone builds, you also have to look at things beyond you and beyond now. So it's, when you're gone or the application needs to live on, it's going to have bigger requirements as time goes on. So let's look at it more from that line of pace of innovation. I wrote a little article on LinkedIn that showed, Drupal is not an AI platform, but it's astounding to me that it already has modules for Watson, already has modules for Google Vision API, already has modules for Google Vision. And we've played with those modules, and it was remarkable out of the gates that we could, throw an image through Drupal and connect it to Vision API. It not only knew that there was a dog in the picture, but it knew it was a husky. And it could tag taxonomy terms via Drupal that were managed in Drupal from this AI engine. And just recently I saw this other module that was interesting, a Microsoft Cognitive Service, which again tries to deal with automatic alt tags. Now, I think sure there's debate that can sometimes work for you, but of course not always, and the context is great when it is, but only in the right use case. I see Mike laughing right now because I'm sure that's but when there's a context where you're allowing the citizens to put up an image, and even if there's an element where they can't put up descriptions, there are potential use cases where this could help. And at the very least, if you look at it from an efficiency standpoint, it can allow someone who's tasked with doing this, well, here's what it gave me out of the gates. Now maybe I just need to correct it or adjust it, but maybe 80% of the time it's fine. Looking at something more like Alexa and Drupal. When you search those two terms together, you've got 600,000 plus results. So that's quite telling. You got videos on how to do things, and you even have documentation on how to incorporate Alexa in Drupal. Three takeaways. I'm going to be quick on some of this. So fish. I don't have my notes. I'm just going off of what I have here. But swim with the school. So, I mean, strength in numbers. If everyone's going in one direction and you're going the other direction, that's usually a pretty good indication. So, you know, feature velocity, the only way it works is when you've got critical mass. So you've got support, you've got resources. There's a Drupal camp event taking place right here in Ottawa, I believe hosted at Ottawa U.
Yeah, October 27th.
October 27th as an example. So, you know, that goes a long way. Security in numbers. So the more sets of eyes there is on your code, you guys have probably already heard this today, but, you know, security through obscurity has failed. Alignment with community. So we sort of just touched on this towards the end, but you know, you can't be responsible for trying to keep up with standards, compliance, things like WxT and React. But even your own specific needs, right? Google whatever you need with Drupal and you'd be surprised that there's already people probably talking about it. I use an example that we did for a client around ORCID. And it's an open science requirement and there's already, you know, UCLA has already contributed a ton of work to this and there's already communities that are working to this with Drupal. So factor it. So this one could be seen as a little bit harsh, but beware of sheep's and wolves clothing. So you have to be able to differentiate. You have to be able to differentiate. You know, the open source community demands transparency, and we've had examples of this time over time. Even when MySQL fell into Oracle, Postgres went through the roof. It's just organically how the open source community is going to work. And we need to be able to identify and see those things as different, you know, when they're there and to know the difference. So tools and environments, you know, we've done projects, I believe it was with United Nations, we were stuck using Visual Studio to commit our code. And it's the first time we've ever had to pay a license for all of our staff to be able to have to commit code. I mean, that's a factor. Even, you know, with GitHub and the acquisition, sure, things are changing, but, you know, there's also 50,000 projects that left GitHub that same week. And that's indicative of, you know, maybe the entire open source community is looking at that. We've talked about vendor lock-in in the past, but there's also cloud lock-in, which we've heard from departments, as well as code lock-in. There's some of those components where you're starting. These are things that we still need to factor. So stacks and licenses. So if you have an API, is that really considered open? And if you have an open source language, but it all leads to a license stack, example, the .NET, is that truly a fully open source solution? Well, you know, going with what you know just because that's what you know, and if you're a .NET developer, you still need to factor that it's going to be probably relying on a license stack to run. It's a factor to consider. Apps claiming open source, yet they're just based or using open source. So there's a difference, a big difference. I think even, you know, we sort of identified that today through a few claims, and we see tools like Adobe EM that are running Tomcat or running Java, but their source code is not contributed back to the community. And there's a fundamental difference there. So just because you take something and then you open source it doesn't mean they will come. I think Joel has coined the phrase of the field of dreams. Just because you build it does not mean that they're going to come to the table. It does have to be, you know, and I think that's the strength in Drupal. It's completely transparent. There's no corporate head on it, and it was given genuinely back to the community, and that's why it's done so well. Okay, you guys all wanted to know, okay, well, what's the Kenny Rogers? What's the gambler song aspect of it, right? So you got to know when to code them, know when to download them, when to patch away, and know when to run, right? So you don't want to be an island of one, right? So knowing when to code goes a long way. There's responsibilities that comes with coding. So if you code something, you now have to manage the responsibility of the security of that, the long-term maintenance of that, right? So I keep quoting other people here, but Mike likes to say free as in kittens, not free as in beer. Well, there's a responsibility when you're given a kitten. You've got to foster it and maintain it, and you can't, you know, it's not like beer. You can just drink and you're done. Know when to download them. So, you know, contributions and community guidance. Some people will say that they're open source or that they've got open APIs, but if they're not publicly giving you toolkits or publicly giving you access to the code, then you have to sort of call that out and say, well, is it truly open source? Can I right now download it and run it locally right off my laptop like I can Drupal, for example, in Drupal WxT? I mean, those are fundamentally different comparisons. Know when to patch them. So, you know, don't let the tail wag the dog. There's an element there where we've seen a lot of people go with default to what they know. And, you know, that's a bit of a pet peeve. So we are calling out people who are just turning to IT and it just defaults to, well, this, you know, we're that kind of shop, so this is what we're going to work off. versus evaluating what's already in the community and factoring that as asset and equity. I mean, that's the true measure. So people talk about total cost of ownership. Well, they have a responsibility to look at it in this limelight. Time's up, almost to the second. Questions? I think I'm the last session, so that means you can barrage me with questions. Like he's happy because at the last second I said, thank you, questions. All right, any questions, anything? Drupal compliance? No? Awesome. All right, thanks guys.
Thank you very much.